Welcome to Whispers in the Dark. Picture this, you're trapped on a desolate farm following strange rules meant to keep you safe. But what if those rules were designed to trap you? As night falls, something unearthly stalks you and the sunflowers start to watch. The truth, it's more horrifying than you ever imagined. Stay tuned, what happens next will terrify you. The Stranger's Request. Avery had always been one to cherish the quiet. The rhythmic ticking of a clock, the soft whisper of the wind, the rustling of leaves in the trees. These small, seemingly inconsequential sounds were all she needed to feel at peace. But life had a way of tearing that peace apart, a way of making her crave solace even more. A year ago, her world had shattered when her fiancé, Daniel, was taken from her in a sudden, tragic accident. He had been the light of her life, the person she'd thought she would grow old with, and now that light was gone. The emptiness was suffocating, and Avery had tried everything to fill the void. She moved to a new city, found a new job, and tried to bury herself in the distractions of life. But nothing seemed to work. It was as if the weight of her grief was wrapped around her heart, slowly squeezing the life out of her. One night, as she scrolled through an online job board, something caught her eye. Caretaker wanted for rural farm in Maine. Room and board provided. Avery's eyes lingered on the ad. It seemed so simple. No complicated tasks. No long hours in front of a computer screen, just a quiet life tending to animals and crops. Something about it spoke to her. Perhaps it was the promise of solitude or the idea of escaping the city. Either way, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away from everything, to finally breathe again. Without hesitation, Avery sent an email. Within hours, she received a reply from the Garrison family. They were kind, their words reassuring, and they offered her the position immediately. She was to arrive in 2 days. The timing seemed too perfect. Avery booked her flight, packed her bags, and made her way to the remote farm nestled deep in the hills of Maine, a place so isolated that the nearest town was nearly an hour's drive away. The drive from the airport to the farm was long and winding, the road barely wide enough for her car, surrounded by dense trees that blocked out the sun. The further she went, the more she felt the weight of isolation pressing in on her. The world around her grew quieter, the silence becoming almost oppressive. Avery could feel the tension building in her chest, but she pushed it aside. She was here for a reason, to escape, to heal. As she pulled up the long driveway, the farmhouse finally came into view, nestled in the heart of the sprawling land. The building was old, its wood weathered and gray, but there was a charm to it. A garden of flowers bloomed near the porch, and a few chickens clucked in the yard. Despite the solitude, the place had a certain warmth to it. The Garrison family greeted her at the door, a couple in their late 50s with kind faces, their smiles genuine and welcoming. "Welcome to the farm, Avery," the husband Thomas said as he shook her hand. "We're glad to have you here." His wife, Clara, a woman with soft gray eyes and a comforting presence, placed a hand on her shoulder. "We're grateful for your help, dear. It's a bit of a simple life out here, but it's peaceful, and we're sure you'll settle in quickly." They led her inside, where the air was warm and smelled faintly of wood and earth. The house was cozy, if a bit cluttered, with old wooden beams and a large fireplace that seemed to dominate the room. Clara showed her to a small bedroom upstairs, explaining that she would have the room to herself for the duration of her stay. It was a modest space, but it was all hers. Avery felt a small flicker of hope spark within her. Maybe this was exactly what she needed, a fresh start. The Garrison family provided her with a list of tasks and a set of rules for the farm. It seemed simple enough. Feed the animals at dawn, make sure the irrigation system was working properly, check the crops for pests, and stock the farm stand twice a day. But as she sat down to read the list, something about the rules struck her as odd. Rule 1. Please feed the goats and chickens at 6 a.m. sharp. They get very cranky if it's late. Rule 2. You will need to prune the floricanes and raspberry bushes. Wear thick gloves. If you get scratched, head inside immediately and call Dr. Halsey to ensure your wound isn't infected. Rule 3. The sunflower field is beautiful but requires attention. If you ever see a sunflower that isn't facing the same direction as the others, go inside immediately. Do not go back outside until the next day. Rule 4. The farm is surrounded by forest. Sometimes coyotes, foxes, or other wild animals roam the grounds. Do not worry about the animals. The pens are secure. However, do not leave the farmhouse after sunset. Rule 5. Do not enter the corn maze even if you hear what sounds like a child crying from within. The maze isn't open to the public yet. Rule 6. If you hear the goats awake during the night, don't be alarmed. They are semi-nocturnal and often wander during the dark hours. Rule 7. You may help yourself to any of the fruits and vegetables you harvest, except for the apples from the northwest corner of the orchard. Rule 8. We no longer use scarecrows. If you see one, return to the house immediately, lock the doors, and close all curtains. Stay inside until morning. Rule 9. Always stock the farm stand twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. At night, bring all unsold produce inside and store it in the fridge. Rule 10. We do not own pigs. Avery frowned as she finished reading the list. The rules felt oddly specific, almost as though they were designed to keep something hidden from her. But what? It all seemed harmless in a way, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the farm than what met the eye. The first night was uneventful except for the odd sense of stillness that seemed to permeate the house. There were no sounds of city traffic, no distant hum of electronics, just the silence of the land stretching out around her. The stillness was peaceful, but it also made her uneasy. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The next morning she woke early to begin her tasks. She had no intention of breaking any of the rules, at least not yet. Avery went outside to feed the animals, the early morning fog still hanging in the air. The goats were already waiting for her, huddled together near the fence. Their eyes gleamed oddly in the mist, almost too keen. As she approached, one of the goats stared at her with eyes that were far too dark, an unnatural shade of amber that sent a chill down her spine. "Hello there," Avery murmured, trying to shake off the odd feeling creeping over her. She opened the gate and filled the goat's trough with food, but the goat with the strange eyes didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her as though it were watching her every move. Avery felt her heartbeat quicken, but she pushed the feeling aside. "You're just tired, Avery," she muttered to herself. "It's been a long drive, it's nothing." She finished feeding the animals and moved on to the chicken, but as she worked, she couldn't shake the sensation that she was being watched. Every time she looked up, she felt like something in the distance was staring at her, waiting. Her eyes were drawn to the sunflower field as she turned to head back toward the house. The flowers, tall and bright, swayed gently in the breeze. Avery paused. One of the sunflowers stood out, the only one not facing the others. Instead, it was staring directly at her. Its dark center seemed almost alive, like a pupil watching her intently. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Hadn't the garrison's rules said something about this? Something about never leaving the sunflower field once one of them turned toward you? Avery swallowed hard, feeling the tension tighten in her chest. Her pulse raced as she locked eyes with the sunflower. It was impossible to explain, but it felt as though it was waiting for something, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Panic bubbled inside her. She quickly locked the chicken coop and hurried back to the house, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stepped inside, she slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. She leaned against the door, gasping for breath. The house felt suffocatingly silent, as though the air had thickened with something unseen. Avery turned to look out the window. The sunflower field was still there, and in the distance she could just make out the figure of the sunflower still facing her. And for a brief moment she thought she saw it move. But that was impossible. She closed the curtains and went to the kitchen, trying to calm her racing thoughts. "It's just my imagination," she whispered aloud. "It's just stress. It's just the isolation." But deep down she knew something was off. She had stepped into a place where rules weren't just to be followed, they were warnings. And as she sat at the small kitchen table, the chill of the morning still lingering in her bones, she couldn't help but wonder what was waiting for her at the farm. And why had the Garrison family been so secretive about everything? The silence pressed in around her, thick and suffocating. And in the back of her mind, a nagging thought lingered. This farm was no ordinary place, and it had a way of keeping its secrets buried deep beneath the earth. The first rule broken. The days on the farm passed in a haze of routine. Avery had grown accustomed to the quiet, the isolation that surrounded her like a thick, suffocating fog. The farm was peaceful in its own way, but it was also unnerving. She woke each morning to the same rituals, feeding the goats, tending to the chickens, checking the irrigation lines, and each evening the same eerie calm descended over the land. But it wasn't just the monotony that unsettled her. It was the feeling of being watched. It started small. An odd glance from one of the goats, the way their eyes seemed to follow her every move. But it was the sunflowers that haunted her, the towering plants that stood at the edge of the field, their heads tilted toward the setting sun each evening. She had done as instructed, kept her distance, followed the rules set by the Garrison family. But that one rule, Rule 3, about the sunflowers, the one that warned her not to approach if one of them faced her, that rule kept gnawing at her like an itch she couldn't scratch. It felt trivial, but it also felt like a warning, a dark whisper in the back of her mind. Avery had spent the last few days distracting herself with the chores, trying not to think too much about the sunflowers. But it was always there, this lingering sense of dread whenever her gaze wandered toward the field. She couldn't help it. She was drawn to them, drawn to that strange rule, the one that seemed almost absurd. But what was so dangerous about one sunflower turning the wrong way? It was a quiet evening, the kind of silence that hung heavily in the air, thick and expectant. Avery had just finished her tasks for the day, feeding the goats, checking the chickens, bringing in the last of the crops, and she sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The farm felt unnervingly still tonight. The wind had died down, and the usual evening sounds, the rustling of the trees, the distant croaking of frogs, were absent. It was just an overwhelming, oppressive quiet, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. Avery's eyes were drawn to the sunflower field, illuminated by the pale light of the moon. The rows of sunflowers stood like silent sentinels, their faces all angled in the same direction, following the moon's arc across the sky. But as she stared at the flowers, she noticed something, the faintest shift in the air, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then her gaze locked onto one sunflower. It wasn't facing the others. It wasn't looking toward the moon. It was staring directly at her. Her heart skipped a beat. The moonlight glinted off the black center of the flower, and for a moment, Avery thought she could see something moving inside it, something that shouldn't be there. A flicker of shadow, a ripple of movement, almost imperceptible. But it was enough to make her skin crawl. She could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and heavy, pressing against her chest. It was impossible. It shouldn't have been possible, but there it was, that sunflower looking straight at her. Avery's breath quickened, and before she could stop herself, she stood up, her legs unsteady as though the ground itself was shaking beneath her feet. She tore her eyes away from the sunflower, as if by doing so she could erase the horrible truth of what she had seen. No, this was absurd. It was just a plant, a part of the farm, and she was making it into something much more terrifying than it was. But the fear still clung to her, wrapping itself around her heart, squeezing tighter and tighter. She had to get inside. She had to leave. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she hurried to the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. As she stepped into the house, she slammed the door shut behind her, the heavy sound reverberating through the stillness of the room. She leaned against it, breathing heavily, her body trembling. The sunflowers couldn't be real. The farm couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Something was watching her. Avery's mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had seen, but deep down she knew that the sunflowers weren't just plants, they were something else. She didn't know what, but she couldn't ignore the way they moved, the way they watched. It wasn't right. She sank down onto the couch, rubbing her temples. It's just your imagination, Avery, she thought. Just a trick of the mind. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her breathing. But when she opened them again, the feeling hadn't gone away. It was still there, heavy in the air, like a storm waiting to break. The night dragged on, and Avery eventually managed to fall asleep. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. The nightmares came quickly, and with them, the sunflowers. In her dreams, they were everywhere, their heads swaying and turning toward her, their faces stretching and distorting, growing larger and more monstrous with every passing second. And all the while, their eyes followed her, burning with an unnatural intensity, as if they were waiting for something. Avery woke up with a start, her heart hammering in her chest. It was still dark outside, the moonlight spilling through the window. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread that clung to her like a second skin. But she couldn't escape it. The sunflowers were still out there in the field, watching. The next morning, Avery forced herself to carry on with her duties. The sunflowers were just flowers, she told herself. Nothing more. And yet, every time she glanced toward the field, that creeping sense of unease came rushing back. It was as if the very earth around her was holding its breath, waiting for something, watching her. The day passed in a blur, each task feeling heavier than the last. The tension in her chest never eased. And when night fell again, the unease only grew. There were no sounds, no wind, no insects, not even the distant hoot of an owl. Just the oppressive silence of the farm. It was as though the land itself had been swallowed by some deep, suffocating void. As the moon rose higher in the sky, Avery found herself drawn to the window, her eyes once again seeking the sunflowers. And there they were, standing tall and still in the moonlight, their faces directed toward the horizon. But one stood out. The same sunflower, the same one from the night before. It was facing her again. Her heart skipped a beat, the fear crawling up her spine like a cold hand. She backed away from the window, her legs trembling. She knew she shouldn't go outside. She knew the rules. But something inside her, a primal instinct, was urging her to step out, to confront it, to see if it was real. But she didn't. Instead, she locked the doors and closed the curtains, hoping against hope that if she ignored it, it would go away. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't. She had broken the rule, and now the farm was going to make her pay. The following days were a blur of dread. Every time she went outside, she felt the eyes of the sunflowers on her, following her every move. But it wasn't just the sunflowers. Strange noises began to seep into the night, rustlings in the woods, low growls from the direction of the barn, and sometimes whispers on the wind as if the land itself was trying to speak. One evening, as she brought in the last of the crops, Avery caught a glimpse of something near the barn, a shadowy figure barely visible in the dim light. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then she saw it again, shifting unnaturally, like a being that wasn't quite human. Its outline wavered, distorted by the dim glow of the lantern. And as it moved, it seemed to fade in and out of sight as though it were neither here nor there. Avery froze, her blood running cold. The figure was gone before she could make sense of it, but the fear lingered. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something else. The days continued to blend together, each one more oppressive than the last. The farm, the sunflowers, the eerie figures. It was all too much. But as Avery lay in bed that night, listening to the silence, she realized something chilling. The farm wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it was waiting for her to break. And she had just done that. The rules were no longer just guidelines. They were warnings. Warnings that she had ignored, and now the farm was going to claim her. She could feel it. It was in the air, in the walls, in the ground beneath her feet. And the worst part, it had only just begun. Strange noises from the woods. The days dragged on in an endless rhythm, each one mirroring the last. Avery fell into a predictable routine, waking up at dawn to feed the animals, checking the crops for pests, and trying, unsuccessfully, to ignore the gnawing sense of something unnatural lurking in the farm's corners. The sunflowers seemed to grow taller each day, their dark eyes following her as she moved across the fields. But it wasn't just the sunflowers that made her feel watched. The trees, the wind, the very land itself seemed to pulse with an eerie, disquieting energy. It wasn't long before she began to hear it. At first, it was faint, almost like a distant memory. A cry, soft and distant, drifting through the night air. It was high-pitched, unmistakably the sound of a child. The kind of cry that made a parent's heart ache. But Avery wasn't a parent, and the farm was far from a place where children were supposed to be. Still, there was something about the sound, something familiar about it, that drew her in, even as a flicker of warning ignited deep within her gut. She tried to ignore it. The first few nights, she told herself it was nothing more than a trick of the wind, a bizarre echo from the neighboring woods. She had read about animals mimicking human sounds, heard tales of coyote calls that sounded like babies crying. But as the nights passed, the sound grew louder, more insistent. "Help me," it seemed to say. "Please help me." The cry echoed across the dark expanse of the farm, tugging at her heart, making her uneasy but unwilling to look away. The rules the Garrison family had given her flashed through her mind, reminding her of the strict boundaries she was supposed to respect. Do not leave the farmhouse after sunset. Do not enter the corn maze. Avery felt the weight of the rules pressing down on her chest, but the cries from the woods were relentless, like an invisible hand reaching out to her, pulling her toward the unknown. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and if she didn't find out what it was now, she would never know peace. One evening, the cries were louder than ever. They pierced through the thick, oppressive silence that hung over the farm like a heavy fog. Avery stood by the window, staring out into the dark woods beyond the field, her pulse quickening with every cry that echoed in the night. She should have stayed inside. The rules told her not to go out there, but she couldn't stop herself. She grabbed a flashlight and wrapped herself in a heavy jacket, stepping out into the night. The cold air hit her immediately, sharp and biting, but it did nothing to numb the fear creeping up her spine. She moved quickly across the yard, her boots crunching against the frost-covered earth, the sound far too loud in the unnatural stillness of the night. The world around her was too quiet, too still, except for those cries. The cries that pulled her deeper into the woods. As Avery reached the edge of the forest, the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. The moon hung high above, its pale light casting long shadows between the trees. The cries were louder now, closer, and yet still distant, as if the source of the sound was beckoning her into the heart of the woods. She hesitated, her breath coming in shallow bursts, but then she pressed on. She had to know. She couldn't just sit there, wondering. Curiosity, or maybe something darker, urged her forward. The woods seemed to close in around her, the trees towering like silent sentinels watching her every move. Her flashlight flickered in the damp air, casting erratic shadows on the ground. And then she saw it. The corn maze. It stood like a dark silhouette against the night sky, the tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze, a strange and foreboding presence. Avery knew she shouldn't go in. The Garrison family had been clear about that. No one was allowed in the maze. But the cries were coming from inside, she was sure of it. She couldn't ignore them any longer. Something was waiting. She could feel it, a cold pull at the pit of her stomach. With her heart pounding in her chest, she stepped forward and entered the maze. The air was thick and humid, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves overwhelming her senses. The path ahead twisted and turned, the corn stalks whispering in the breeze, their rustling almost too loud in the silence. Avery's flashlight cut a thin line through the dark, revealing the jagged, uneven paths ahead. As she moved deeper into the maze, the cries grew louder, sharper. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the thick rows of corn. Avery's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she heard a whimper, followed by a soft, almost pleading voice. "Help me." It wasn't a cry anymore. It was a voice, clear and unmistakable, though it still carried the eerie, guttural quality of the forest itself. Avery froze. The air felt cold now, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, a primal instinct telling her that something wasn't right. She should have turned back then. She should have listened to the rules. But something inside her refused to let go of the need to know. She pushed forward, forcing her legs to move, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she made her way deeper into the maze. The cries came again, more desperate this time, and as she moved past one particularly thick patch of corn, she heard something, rustling. The sound was too loud, too deliberate. Avery stopped, her breath caught in her throat. Out of the corner of her eye she saw movement, something huge, something that didn't belong, a flash of something black, no, wrong. It was a creature, but it wasn't quite right. It had the shape of a wildcat, but its eyes, those eyes were human. Cold, calculating, and terrifyingly intelligent. It froze, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as it stared at her, unblinking. its fur matted and torn. The creature's mouth opened, revealing jagged teeth that gleamed under the faint light of her flashlight. Avery's heart pounded in her chest as panic surged through her. She took a step back, her foot catching on the uneven ground, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might freeze there, paralyzed by fear. But then a loud noise, a distant crackling, broke the tension. The creature's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment it seemed to hesitate. In that instant, Avery bolted. She ran, stumbling through the maze, not daring to look back. The rustling of the corn stalks grew louder, like 1,000 whispering voices, urging her to keep moving. Her lungs burned with every breath, her legs aching as she pushed herself forward, the creature's chilling presence still haunting the edges of her mind. The exit of the maze was just ahead, but as she neared the end, she caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned, her pulse racing. A figure stood at the far edge of the maze, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its outline distorted by the shadows. It wasn't human, no, it couldn't be. The figure seemed to move, shifting unnaturally, as if it were part of the darkness itself. Avery's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. The figure didn't approach. It didn't need to, it simply watched. She tore her gaze away, forcing her feet to move, her body screaming for her to escape. She didn't look back as she emerged from the maze, stumbling into the open field. She didn't stop running until she was back inside the farmhouse, the door slamming behind her with a finality that echoed through the stillness. She locked it, her hands trembling, her heart still pounding in her chest. Something had followed her. Something she hadn't seen, but she knew it was there, lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment. And she knew without a doubt that the farm was far more than just a place of solitude. It was a place of horrors, and she was only beginning to scratch the surface. The unseen watcher. Avery had hoped that, as time passed, the farm would become a place of refuge, a quiet haven where she could find some semblance of peace, where the weight of her grief could slowly be lifted by the hum of daily life. She had longed for the stillness, for the solitude. But now, each morning she woke, the air felt thicker, the silence heavier. The feeling of being watched never left her. At first it was subtle, a fleeting sensation that she might have imagined, like a whisper carried on the wind, just out of earshot. But as the days bled into one another, that feeling grew stronger, more tangible. It wasn't just the sunflowers anymore. It was the very land that felt alive, watching her every move, waiting for something. Avery could feel it in her bones. She couldn't explain it, but every step she took, every corner she turned, it was there, a presence just out of sight, but always there. It began with small things, figures in the distance. She would look up, out toward the edge of the property, and for a split second she would see them, shadows standing between the trees. At first, she convinced herself they were just trees, or maybe even distant farm equipment caught in the wind. But as the days wore on, the figures seemed to grow clearer, more defined. Avery tried to ignore it. The Garrison family had warned her about the isolation, about the strange, oppressive quiet that sometimes settled over the farm. They had told her not to venture out too far after dark, and certainly not to approach the old scarecrows in the fields. Rule 8. If you see a scarecrow, retreat immediately. Don't even think about it. She had laughed it off at first. Scarecrows. How could something so innocent, so commonplace, be dangerous? But the longer she stayed on the farm, the more she began to feel the truth in those rules. The unease she had pushed down so many times now bubbled to the surface, and she started to wonder if there was more to the farm than she had ever imagined. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Avery was working in the garden, pulling weeds from the rows of vegetables. It was a simple task, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every time she looked up, her gaze was drawn toward the farthest corner of the field where the scarecrows stood like silent sentinels. At first, she saw nothing unusual, but then a movement caught her eye, a flicker of motion behind one of the scarecrows. Her heart skipped a beat. She blinked, and when she looked again, she saw it. The scarecrow's arm, the one closest to the barn, twitched. It was almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make her stomach turn. The arm jerked slightly as though it had been pulled by some unseen force, and for a moment it seemed as though the scarecrow was coming to life. Avery's breath caught in her throat. She stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. The scarecrow, standing there motionless for so long, had suddenly shifted, its limbs moving in unnatural, jerking motions, like a rag doll being manipulated by a child. Her skin prickled with fear and her heart pounded in her chest. Was she losing her mind? Was this farm slowly driving her mad? She forced herself to look away, shaking her head. "It's just the wind," she whispered, though she didn't believe it. It had to be the wind. Scarecrows didn't move, not like that. But something inside her refused to let go of the image. She could still see it, the scarecrow's twisted, jerky movements, its arms flailing unnaturally in the wind. What was it? What had she seen? That night, Avery locked herself inside the farmhouse, her mind racing. She turned on the lights, even though the farm didn't have any power at night. She felt safer that way, surrounded by the glow of the light. But she couldn't escape the feeling that the shadows outside were moving too, shifting in the corners of her vision. She pressed her back against the kitchen counter, her fingers tight around a mug of lukewarm tea. Every noise in the house seemed amplified, the creaking of the floorboards, the faint whistle of the wind outside. But it wasn't just the sounds inside the house that unsettled her. It was the silence that greeted her every time she turned toward the window. There were no animals calling out, no rustling of leaves, just a deep, suffocating silence. A silence that felt like something was waiting, something watching. Avery's mind was starting to spiral. Had she seen the scarecrow move? Or had she imagined it? Could it have been a trick of the light, some optical illusion playing on her exhausted mind? Her eyes flicked toward the window again, drawn by an invisible force. And there, standing at the edge of the field, was a figure. Not a scarecrow this time, but something tall and shapeless, obscured by the shadows. It was far away, but she could see it. A silhouette against the night sky, a shape that didn't quite belong. Avery's pulse quickened, and she took a step back. No, she had to be imagining it. She pulled the curtains shut, but it was too late. The image of the figure lingered in her mind, as real and solid as if it had been standing right in front of her. She could still feel its presence, its gaze. Her phone buzzed, and Avery jumped, startled by the sudden noise. She quickly grabbed it, eager for a distraction, her hands trembling. The message was from Ben, an old friend from her time in the city. She hadn't heard from him in weeks, and his message made her stomach tighten. "Ben, Avery, I know this sounds crazy, but you need to be careful out there. There's something wrong with that farm. I saw it when I was there years ago. The scarecrows, they aren't just there to keep the birds away. They're connected to the land. They're part of a curse, Avery. I saw one of them move just like you did. It's not a trick of the light. Be careful." Avery stared at the message, her breath catching in her throat. The words seemed to punch through her defenses, her mind spinning in disbelief and terror. She had laughed at the rules, at the absurdity of them, but Ben's message made her blood run cold. The curse. It was real. The scarecrows weren't just there for decoration. They weren't just creepy relics of a bygone time. They were alive, and they were part of something far darker than she could have imagined. Avery's hand shook as she set her phone down. She had to do something. She had to figure out what was happening. But she couldn't be alone. Not anymore. Her mind raced back to the figure she had seen outside. It hadn't been a person. It had been something else. It had been watching her just like the scarecrow. Avery felt her breath catch in her throat, her hands going cold. She knew now that there was no going back. The farm was more than just a place to escape her grief. It was a trap. A place where something ancient and twisted had taken root, and she had been drawn into it. She could feel the eyes of the scarecrows on her, even now, as she sat locked inside the farmhouse. She couldn't explain it, but she knew it was true. They were watching her, waiting for her, and the worst part was that she had no idea what they wanted. The dark history of the farm. Avery had spent days trying to ignore the mounting sense of dread that weighed heavily on her shoulders. The oppressive silence of the farm had seeped into her bones, and the strange occurrences, the flickering shadows in the fields, the unnerving movements of the scarecrows, had started to take a toll on her. Every corner she turned seemed to be watching her. Every gust of wind whispered secrets she wasn't ready to hear. She couldn't shake the feeling that something far older and far darker was buried beneath the soil of this place, something that was pulling at her, urging her to uncover its truth. She needed answers. Avery had heard rumors from the few locals who passed through the area, murmurs of something not quite right with the land, but the details were always hazy, always vague. No one seemed willing to speak openly about it, and every time she tried to ask the Garrison family about the farm's history, they grew distant, their smiles tighter, their words more clipped. They had warned her to stay focused on her tasks and never to question the land. It was as though they were afraid to speak the truth. It was one evening, after another restless night filled with vivid nightmares of twisting sunflowers and grotesque scarecrows, that Avery made up her mind. She needed to know what had happened here, what curse had been set upon this place, and why she had been drawn into it. She needed to uncover the history of the farm. Her first lead came in the form of Theo, a local historian who ran a small, cluttered bookstore just outside of town. She had heard of him from the few brave souls who dared to venture to the farm for supplies, his name whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. Theo was the kind of man who spent his days digging through dusty old records, searching for the secrets buried in the past. It was exactly the kind of person Avery needed. The bookstore was small, tucked away behind a row of aging houses, its windows fogged with age. The faint smell of ink and paper filled the air as Avery pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly. The shop was cluttered with shelves that seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten tomes and ancient maps. Theo stood behind the counter, his hunched back giving him the appearance of someone who had spent too long reading under dim light. His eyes, however, were sharp, his movements quick and purposeful. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly, as if it had been worn smooth by years of silence. Avery hesitated, unsure of how to begin, but the fear gnawing at her was too much. She had to know. "I've been staying at the Garrison farm," she said, her voice tight, "and I think there's something wrong with it. I need to know its history. What happened there?" Theo's eyes narrowed, and for a long moment he simply stared at her. His hands remained still, resting on the counter, But there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a flash of recognition, of fear. "You shouldn't be there," he said, his tone low, almost a whisper. "Not if you value your life. That place is cursed." Avery's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected it, but to hear him say it out loud sent a chill through her veins. "Cursed?" she asked, her voice barely a murmur. "What do you mean?" Theo sighed, a deep, heavy sound, as if the weight of the past had taken its toll on him. He gestured for her to sit at a small table in the back of the shop. Avery complied, her heart racing in anticipation of the answers she was about to receive. "Let me tell you about the widow," Theo began, his voice growing softer. "The original owner of the farm. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was a young woman married to a man who ran a small trading business. They lived in the house you now call the Garrison Farm, but that was before it became what it is now." He paused, eyes distant as if he was seeing something far beyond the cluttered walls of the bookstore. "Margaret was a woman of great beauty, but she wasn't the type to care much about her looks. She had a sharp mind, an unyielding spirit. Her husband, however, was not so kind. He was a greedy man, always scheming, always looking for ways to make more money, and that greed led him to betray Margaret in the worst possible way." Avery listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She could sense that the tale Theo was about to unfold would be the key to everything. "One day," Theo continued, "he sold the farm out from under her. He tricked her into signing over the property in exchange for a small sum of money. The deal was rigged, a deception so cunning that Margaret didn't realize what had happened until it was too late." Avery's fingers clenched into fists. "He stole it from her." "Yes," Theo said, his voice heavy with sadness. "And the worst part was that Margaret had no way to fight it. Her husband left her, taking the money and abandoning her to the mercy of the new owners. It was an old widow who sold the land, and the moment Margaret realized the betrayal, she cursed the land. She cursed the farm, the soil, and anyone who set foot on it. She promised that anyone who entered the land would become twisted, changed by its curse, bound to the land for all eternity." Avery's stomach churned at the thought of a woman's rage manifesting in such a dark way, but something about the story felt right. She had felt the presence of the farm, the deep, suffocating darkness that seemed to seep into her very soul. It was a land that had been warped, shaped by something far beyond her understanding. Margaret's curse wasn't just a superstition, Theo continued, his voice lowering. It was real. Anyone who trespassed on the land, anyone who tried to make a home there would be transformed, turned into something else. Something twisted like the scarecrows you've seen, or the pigs you've heard about. Avery felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. "The scarecrows." "Yes," Theo said, his voice a whisper now. "They are alive in a way. The land has bound them to its curse. It changes those who step on it, warps their bodies and their souls until they're nothing but husks, shadows of who they once were." Avery shuddered, her mind racing. The figure she had seen in the maze, the way the scarecrow had moved. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't her imagination. The farm was alive, in a way that no one should have ever dared to understand. Theo's eyes were filled with regret. The Garrison family, they knew about the curse. They knew what it could do, but they didn't care. They wanted the land, they wanted the wealth that came with it. And so they've kept it hidden, kept the truth buried, but it's still here. It's always been here. Avery's mind was reeling. The Garrison family had been living with this curse all along, playing ignorant, pretending to be normal. But what about her? Why had they let her come here? What were they waiting for? Theo looked at her, his expression grave. You need to leave now, before it's too late. The curse has already started to take hold of you, hasn't it? I can see it in your eyes. The land is calling you. It wants you to stay." Avery's breath hitched. She could feel the pull, the invisible force that had been guiding her since the moment she arrived. It was too late. She had already broken the rules, already made contact with the farm's darkness. "I can't leave," she whispered. "Not yet. I need to finish what I started. I can't let it win." Theo's face hardened, but there was something else in his eyes, something dark. "Then you're already too far gone. Once you've crossed the line, there's no going back. But if you won't listen to me, then there's nothing more I can say." With that, he turned away, disappearing into the back of the bookstore. Avery stood there, frozen, as the weight of his words settled over her like a suffocating fog. She had come to the farm seeking peace, seeking a way to escape the ghosts of her past. But instead, she had walked straight into a nightmare. As she left the bookstore, the night air felt colder than before. She could feel the curse watching her, its tendrils creeping through the soil, pulling her deeper into its grasp. She needed to finish this, to uncover the truth about the farm. But at what cost? As she drove home, her old car sputtered and coughed, the engine stalling suddenly as she passed the farm. Avery pulled over to the side of the road, her hands trembling as she tried to restart the car, but it was no use. The engine refused to turn over. A strange feeling washed over her then, a creeping sense of dread that was more than just mechanical failure. Something was out there. She could feel it. And then it happened. Something pulled at the car door from the outside, causing the whole vehicle to shake violently as if something or someone was trying to get in. Avery screamed, her heart racing as the door rattled in its frame. And in that moment she knew she wasn't alone, not anymore. The curse had found her, and it wasn't going to let her go. The transformation begins. Avery tried to keep her composure, to ignore the increasing weight of dread that clung to her every waking moment. But no matter how hard she tried to push it down, the changes in the air, the oddities in the soil, the restless, heavy silence that weighed upon the farm, it was all becoming too much to ignore. The farm had sunk its teeth into her, and no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape. It started slowly, as most things do when something dark begins to take root. At first, Avery brushed it off, just another strange feeling, a passing oddity. Her eyes began to change. The light around her became sharper, brighter, as if the world itself had been cranked up a notch. At first, she thought it was the onset of fatigue, or perhaps a result of too many sleepless nights. But then it got worse. Her eyes would sting when she looked directly at the sun, and she found herself squinting at the slightest flicker of light. The daylight became unbearable, and she had to seek refuge in the shade more and more, just to feel the air on her skin without the oppressive heat gnawing at her from all sides. But it wasn't just her eyes. Avery began to notice other physical changes, too. It was as though her body had started to respond to the land itself. Her skin tingled whenever she touched certain plants, wild bushes, flowers, or even the soil beneath her fingertips. It wasn't a pleasant sensation. It was sharp, electric, as though the earth itself had come alive and was sending its energy directly into her. She couldn't explain it, and she certainly couldn't ignore it. It felt like her body was adapting, changing to something else, something unnatural. The worst part was that Avery couldn't stop herself from obeying the rules. She had tried to ignore them, tried to push back, but it was as if they had been engraved into her very bones. Rule 1, feeding the goats at exactly 6 a.m., became something she couldn't resist. Rule 3, never leave the farmhouse after dark, felt like a command she had to obey. The sunflowers, those haunting, grotesque creatures at the edge of the field, began to call to her, their silent gaze pulling her in, demanding her attention. It wasn't just the rules, though. The land itself had begun to speak to her, softly at first, a whisper carried on the wind. She couldn't remember when the voices started, but they were there, always there, telling her to obey, to submit, to surrender to the farm's pull. She would hear the faintest crying, a child's voice far off, lost in the woods or the cornfield. It was always the same. "Help me. Please help me." The voice was so familiar, so innocent, but it was also wrong. It didn't belong in the woods, in the open fields of the farm. Yet Avery found herself compelled to answer it. Every time the cry echoed through the stillness of the night, she was drawn closer to it, unable to resist. And so, one night, when the moon was full and the night air still, Avery found herself standing at the edge of the sunflower field, her heart pounding as she stared at the glowing yellow petals. She had broken the rules once before, but now something had changed within her. She needed to go to them. She needed to see. The sunflowers stood still in the moonlight, their faces tipped upward, following the light, swaying gently in the evening breeze. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, but Avery knew it was far from that. She could feel the pull now, the tugging at her chest, at her very soul, urging her forward. And then one of them, just one, caught her attention. It wasn't facing the same direction as the others. It was looking at her. The black center of the sunflower seemed to grow larger, deeper, more alive the closer she got. It was as though the flower's eyes were pulling her in, demanding her presence. She reached out, mesmerized, her fingers brushing the sharp edge of the plant's leaves, feeling that familiar tingle run through her skin, deep into her bones. And then it happened. The sunflower's petals snapped outwards, sharper than any thorn, and before Avery could react, it slashed across her hand. Pain coursed through her body, hot and searing. She pulled her hand back, gasping, but when she looked down, the wound wasn't what she had expected. The cut was there, raw and red, but as she watched, it began to heal. The skin closed up almost immediately, the blood vanishing, leaving no trace of the injury. It was as though the wound had never existed at all. Avery's breath caught in her throat as the horror settled into her mind. This wasn't right. None of this was right. The land had begun to claim her, just as Theo had warned. It was changing her, warping her body and mind into something else, something unnatural. Before she could make sense of it, the cries came again, louder now, and Avery realized she was no longer in control. She couldn't help herself. The voices from the woods, the child's cries, were pulling her deeper into the heart of the farm. But the moment she stepped away from the sunflower, she felt the shift. It wasn't just the land that was changing her. The animals, too, were becoming something else. She turned, heart pounding in her chest, to find the goats standing in the distance, watching her. But they weren't just watching. They were waiting, their eyes narrow, their bodies still, as if they were tracking her movements. She froze. It was the way they looked at her now, almost knowing, as if they could see something inside her that she couldn't see. They didn't behave like normal animals anymore. The goats, they were becoming something more too. Something unnatural. Their eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went, watching from the edge of the woods, even when she wasn't looking. Avery quickly moved away from the sunflowers, her pulse racing. The farm had never felt so alive with danger. She needed to escape, needed to break free from the invisible chains that were slowly binding her to this place. But the farm wasn't done with her. As she turned toward the farmhouse, she felt it, another change, a shift in the air. She could sense something moving in the shadows, something watching from the corners of her vision. The trees were swaying and the wind whispered her name. It was as though the farm itself had awakened, and it was no longer satisfied with watching from the edges. It was coming for her. She couldn't run fast enough. The farm was alive, the earth, the plants, the animals, everything was working together to pull her deeper into its grasp. The land was transforming her, bending her to its will, and no matter how hard she tried to escape, she knew that she was bound to it now, bound to its curse. But Avery wasn't ready to give in. That night, as she lay in bed, the nightmares returned, but they were no longer just dreams. They were visions, vivid and painful. The Garrison family, their faces twisted into grotesque, animal-like forms, came to her in the dark, their eyes hollow, their bodies unnaturally stretched and deformed. They whispered her name, their voices a garbled, distorted version of themselves, urging her to join them. And then she saw it, the scarecrow standing tall in the middle of the field, its body made of twisted straw and bone. Its eyes were fixed on her, empty and dark, as if it were waiting for her to come closer. Avery woke with a start, gasping for breath, her skin slick with sweat. The room was dark, but the terror lingered, lingering like a fog that refused to lift. The farm had changed her. It had begun its work, and now it was complete. She could feel the transformation in her veins, in her muscles, in the very marrow of her bones. The farm wasn't just her refuge anymore. It was her prison, her fate intertwined with its cursed soil. And as she lay there, staring into the blackness, she realized she was no longer just Avery. She was becoming something else, something bound to the land, something that would never escape, something that would be twisted by the curse forever. The farm had won. It had claimed her. The truth behind the pigs. The days had become a blur, a string of fragmented moments suspended in a fog of fear and confusion. Avery moved through the motions of her daily tasks, her every step heavy, burdened by the oppressive weight of what she knew and what she was slowly becoming. The land had taken root inside her, twisted her into something she barely recognized. But it wasn't just her own changes that haunted her anymore. It was the pigs. The pigs had always been a part of the farm, quiet, harmless creatures that roamed lazily in their pens, or so she had thought. But lately something had shifted. They were no longer the benign animals she had once dismissed. They were watching her. At first it had been subtle, a flicker of motion out of the corner of her eye, a rustling in the grass, and then the pigs would appear. But it wasn't the normal, docile presence they had once been. No, these pigs, they were different. Their eyes were wrong. The once dull, animalistic gaze had turned into something human, something far too intelligent, something that made the blood in her veins run cold. Avery's heart would race every time she saw them, their dark eyes fixed on her, following her with unnerving intensity. They didn't act like animals anymore. There was something deliberate in their movements, something unnatural. They moved like shadows, always just outside her line of sight, always waiting, always watching. The first time she saw it, really saw it, was one morning when she went to check the barn. The pigs were scattered around, rooting through the hay, but one pig stood apart from the rest. It was a large sow, its body thick and heavy, but what caught Avery's attention were its eyes. Eyes that weren't right. They weren't the dull, glazed eyes of a pig. No. These eyes were sharp, knowing, as if they were staring directly into her soul, remembering her, recognizing her from some dark place she couldn't recall. It was the way it looked at her that made her breath catch in her throat. The pig's eyes gleamed with something unnatural, something alive in a way that no animal's eyes should be. And when she stepped closer, the pig didn't move. It didn't shy away like the others did. It just stood there, watching. Avery felt a cold sweat break out across her back as she backed away slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. It was as though the farm had awakened again, and now these pigs were part of it. They were no longer just animals, they were part of the curse. The land had claimed them too. Rule 10, the one rule she had believed in so deeply, the one that had been drilled into her mind, the one that had made her feel safe, was a lie. The Garrison family didn't just own the pigs, they had changed the pigs. They had become part of the curse, just like everything else on the farm. They had become twisted, horrible. The next day, when Avery tried to confront the Garrisons, she found them oddly distant, almost cold in their manner. Thomas, the patriarch of the family, stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, his face expressionless, his eyes devoid of emotion. When Avery mentioned the pigs, how strange they had become, how they watched her, he simply nodded as if the conversation were of little importance. His response was curt, dismissive, as though he had heard it all before. "You've been seeing things, Avery," Clara, his wife, said in a voice that held no warmth, no kindness. "It's just the isolation. The farm can do that to people. Don't worry about it." But Avery didn't feel reassured. She didn't feel safe. The Garrison's words fell hollow in her ears as though they weren't even speaking to her. Their faces, their eyes, there was something about them that didn't seem quite right. Their smiles were too thin, their eyes too vacant, like they were not really there, like they were somehow not human. She tried to push the thoughts out of her mind, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. The farm had changed her, yes, but it had also changed them. It had twisted them into something strange, something that barely resembled the people they had once been. And it was then that Avery realized she was trapped. There was no escape from this place. The farm had claimed her, and now it was claiming everyone. But as terrifying as the pigs had become, as eerie as the Garrisons had grown, Avery was about to learn that the worst was yet to come. One evening, as dusk settled over the farm and the sky darkened into shades of deep purple, Avery went to the barn to check on the pigs. The air had turned heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying hay. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the soft ground beneath her boots, and as she approached the barn she saw them. The pigs, all of them, gathered near the farthest corner of the pen. But there was something else in the barn with them, something out of place. Avery's blood ran cold when she saw it. A figure, human but not human. It was standing in the corner, hidden in the shadows, watching her with a gaze that was far too intelligent, far too aware. As she stepped closer, she could see it more clearly. A man, but his body was grotesquely distorted. His limbs were too long, too twisted, like they had been pulled from the very soil, and his skin was covered in patches of bristly hair. His face was half covered by a snout, more like a wild boar than a human. His teeth gleamed sharp and yellow, and his eyes, those eyes, were full of knowledge, full of malice. It was the pigman. Avery gasped, her breath hitching in her throat. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs, and her legs felt like they might give out beneath her. The pigman didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on her, as though he were waiting for her to make the first move. The pigs, all of them, stayed still, watching, waiting, as if they were part of the same grotesque, twisted thing. It wasn't just the man who had changed. The pigs, they had all changed too. They had become something more, something darker, something otherworldly. And now they had formed a connection, an unholy union between the man and the creatures of the farm. Avery stumbled backward, her breath coming in gasps. She needed to escape. But the pigman's eyes followed her every movement, and the pigs were closing in, their heavy breathing filling the barn, the sound of it like thunder in her ears. She turned and ran, the barn door slamming behind her with a deafening crash. Her heart was racing, and she didn't stop until she reached the farmhouse. She was shaking, her hands trembling so violently she could barely unlock the door. When she finally managed to step inside, the farmhouse felt empty, as though it were just a shell, just a prison waiting to be sealed around her. Avery pressed her back against the door, breathing heavily, trying to calm herself, but the image of the pigman, the way he had looked at her, haunted her. She couldn't escape him, not anymore. The pigs, the scarecrows, the land itself, it had claimed her, just as it had claimed them. There was no way out. And as she sat there in the dim light of the farmhouse, Avery knew with a sickening certainty that the farm had changed her. She was no longer just a caretaker. She had become part of its curse, bound to it just as much as the twisted figures that lurked in the fields. And the worst part, she still didn't know how to escape. The night was thick with tension, the air heavy and stagnant as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. Avery stood at the edge of the field, looking out over the land that had now become her prison. Her body, once her own, felt foreign to her, a vessel being slowly overtaken by something ancient and malevolent. The farm had twisted her, reshaped her, and now, as she stared into the darkness, she could feel its grip tightening around her chest, squeezing the life out of her. The curse was spreading, and Avery knew deep down that it wasn't just about her anymore. The land was calling for something else, a sacrifice. And she had come to understand that the price of freedom would be steep. Theo, the historian who had warned her so many days ago, had arrived at the farm with an answer, though not one that brought any real comfort. His hands trembled slightly as he unpacked an ancient bundle of rituals, his face drawn and grim. The air around him felt different, charged, as if the very act of invoking the old rites could summon a power far beyond their control. He had come here to undo what had been done, to break the curse that bound the land. But the ritual, he explained, would require a sacrifice. It was the only way. Avery didn't understand it fully, but she knew enough. A life would need to be given in exchange for another's freedom, and it was up to her to decide who would pay the price. Her mind raced as she turned the words over in her head, trying to make sense of it all. Dylan, her boyfriend, the only person who had ever made her feel somewhat human again after everything she had lost, was on his way to the farm. She had tried to warn him, tried to convince him to stay away, but he wouldn't listen. He had always been stubborn, always felt the need to protect her, even when she didn't deserve it. And now he was coming to her, unknowingly walking straight into the very heart of the darkness that had consumed her. Avery knew she couldn't let him come. The land wanted him just as it had wanted her. He would be claimed by it just as she had been. But if he didn't come, if she didn't find a way to break the curse, then they would both be trapped forever. The farm was alive and it was hungry. But who would make the sacrifice? Could she? Could she give herself up to save Dylan, to end the madness that had overtaken them both? The thought of it was unbearable. How could she? The ritual began in the fading light of the evening, with the sky turning an unnatural shade of orange and red. Theo had placed a circle of strange symbols on the ground, drawn with chalk and salt, surrounded by candles that flickered with an eerie, ghostly light. The air smelled of something sour, as if the earth itself had turned rancid, and the wind whispered something in a language Avery couldn't understand, but that she felt deep in her bones. Theo began to chant, his voice rising and falling in the language of the old rites. The words were foreign to her, ancient and filled with power, but the more he spoke, the more she felt something shift beneath her feet. The ground began to tremble, just slightly at first, but with each passing moment it grew stronger. The earth was alive with movement, as though something beneath it was stirring, waking from a deep, eternal slumber. Avery's heart pounded as she looked around. She could feel it now. The land was fighting back. The curse wasn't simply an old superstition or a tale passed down through generations. It was real. It was a living thing, something that could taste their fear and their desperation, something that fed on them. Theo's voice faltered for a moment, his words breaking as the earth beneath them began to shake violently. A deep, guttural rumble rose from the ground, as if the very core of the land was protesting, refusing to give up its claim. The trees around them swayed unnaturally, their roots twisting, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers. Avery's breath caught in her throat as she heard a sound, distant but growing louder. Crying. The child's cry. The same one that had haunted her dreams, the one that had always called her to the edge of the cornfield. But now it wasn't distant, it was right behind her. She turned, panic flooding her veins. It was coming for her, and then she heard it, a voice. It wasn't Dylan's, but it was unmistakable. "Avery, help me, please." She staggered back, her heart racing. The voice was so familiar, yet utterly wrong. She had heard it 1,000 times in her nightmares, but hearing it in the waking world, hearing it now in the cursed soil of this farm, was enough to make her blood run cold. Theo, still chanting, seemed oblivious to the chaos unfolding around them, but Avery couldn't look away. She couldn't tear her eyes from the shadows that were creeping toward her, from the strange shapes moving just out of sight, just beyond the edges of the ritual circle. Her fingers trembled as she glanced toward the barn where she had seen the creatures, the pigs, the scarecrows. And now in the dim light she saw them again. They were there standing in the distance, watching. The pigs, their eyes too human, staring with an unnatural intelligence, waiting for her to make a choice. And then through the dim shadows of the cornfield, a figure emerged. It was tall, too tall, its outline thin and elongated, like a man whose body had been stretched beyond recognition. Its features were barely visible, but Avery could feel its presence as it loomed just outside the ritual circle, watching, waiting, its gaze fixed on her. The earth trembled beneath her feet once more, and Avery's knees buckled as the weight of the curse threatened to crush her. She had to act. She had to make the decision before the land took everything from her. Theo's voice rose in a desperate crescendo, the last words of the ritual hanging in the air, but it was too late. The ground shuddered, and with a deafening roar, a great force erupted from the earth. Avery's eyes went wide as she watched in horror as Theo was pulled into the soil, his body being swallowed by the land itself, his screams silenced by the dark forces that had been awakened. Avery stumbled backward, her heart racing as the very earth seemed to close in around her, drawing her closer to its depths. The curse had won. Theo was gone, and now it was just her and Dylan and the farm. Dylan, he was coming, but would he make it? Would he be swallowed by the farm just like Theo had been? Or would he sacrifice himself for her as she had once feared? As the ground beneath her feet continued to rumble and shift, Avery knew one thing for certain. The final battle was just beginning. She had broken the rules, she had invited the curse, and now the land was demanding payment. Avery turned toward the darkness, toward the ever-growing figure in the field, and the cries, the endless, desperate cries echoed in her mind. She knew what she had to do, but would she have the strength to face what was coming? Or would she too be swallowed by the earth? Would she become another twisted part of the curse? As the wind howled and the shadows crept closer, Avery stood there, frozen, caught between the choices she could never truly escape. And in that moment she realized the farm had already claimed her, the harvest of souls. The wind howled through the empty fields, carrying with it the scent of decay and earth that had grown too old. The sky was a sickly shade of purple, an unnatural twilight that seemed to have stretched on for hours. Avery stood at the edge of the field, her breath shallow, her heart pounding as the weight of what she had to do pressed down on her. Beside her, Dylan stood in silence, his face drawn, eyes wide with the same terror that gripped her chest. They had come this far, too far to turn back. The curse, the land, had twisted everything around them. The Garrison family had kept their secrets, and now Avery and Dylan were trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. The ritual, the final ritual, had to be completed. And yet, as Avery's eyes fell upon the sunflower field before her, she felt a cold dread settle in her gut. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with an insidious energy, the earth alive with the weight of souls that had been claimed. They were standing at the heart of it all. The widow's bones, which Theo had entrusted to them before he was swallowed by the land, were clenched tightly in Avery's hand. The bone, once buried beneath the floorboards of the farmhouse, felt cold and heavy against her palm, as if the weight of the centuries had pressed into it, a grim reminder of the price they would have to pay. The ritual was simple, in theory. It called for the bones of the original landowner, Margaret Hale, the widow who had cursed this land so long ago. With the bones in hand, they were to perform the incantations that would reverse the curse, break its hold on the farm, and free the souls that had been consumed. But nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The sunflowers, towering in front of them, had already begun to change. The petals, once golden and soft, had turned dark, black, like ink spilling from a wound in the earth. Their stems stretched unnaturally tall, their heads bending toward Avery and Dylan as if they were watching, waiting. A low, deep rumble echoed from the ground, a sound that seemed to rise from the very heart of the earth. Avery could feel the land shifting beneath her feet, like something old and forgotten was awakening from a long slumber. Her stomach churned as the noise grew louder, the vibrations beneath her body shaking her to the core. She reached out, her fingers trembling, grasping Dylan's arm. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the rising hum. "We have to do this now, we have no choice." Dylan nodded, his lips pressed tightly together, his face pale. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He had always been the strong one, the protector, but Avery could see that the weight of this place was wearing him down. The land had marked him just as it had marked her. He was as much a part of this curse as she was, and neither of them could escape. Not now, not ever. With a trembling hand, Avery held the widow's bones high in the air, her voice shaking as she began to recite the incantations. The words flowed from her lips in a language she had never heard, but somehow she knew them. They felt right, as if they were a part of her. She felt the energy gathering in the air around them, a dark power swirling, and for a moment she thought she could feel the land responding to the ritual, pushing against them, trying to stop them from finishing what they had started. The sunflowers began to move. Their thick, thorned stems twisted, reaching out toward Avery and Dylan with unnatural speed. The sharp tips of the stems pierced the air, slicing through the thick fog like daggers. Avery gasped and stumbled back, the weight of the bones in her hand growing heavier. The sunflowers, they were alive. The curse was feeding on them. Each flower, each stalk, was part of the land's twisted harvest of souls. The air thickened with a strange, sweet scent, a nauseating perfume that filled Avery's lungs and made her stomach turn. As she glanced around, she could see the shapes in the distance, figures emerging from the mist that surrounded the field. They were coming toward her, their faces twisted, their features warped and unfamiliar. They were the lost souls, the ones who had been claimed by the farm, their bodies turned into something unnatural. Avery's heart skipped a beat as she saw one of the figures more clearly, her mother. But it wasn't her mother. No, it couldn't be. The woman's face was wrong, distorted, like something made from shadows. The skin was stretched too tight, the eyes too hollow. Her mother's form was rotting, her limbs stiff and unnatural. The smell of decay wafted toward Avery, and she gagged, stepping back as the figure's empty eyes locked onto hers. The soul of her mother stood before her, but it wasn't her anymore. She was twisted, bound to the land just like the others, just like Avery would be. Avery's heart ached. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. The curse wasn't just about the land. It was about the souls, the people who had been sacrificed by the farm turned into something other. The farm had consumed them, their essences absorbed by the earth, their bodies twisted into grotesque forms. And now they were feeding the farm, making it stronger. The ground trembled again, and the sound of 1,000 voices seemed to rise from the depths of the field, their whispers merging into one low, guttural murmur. Avery, Dylan, help us. Dylan's hand gripped hers, his fingers tightening with fear, but his resolve was breaking. He could feel it too. The pull of the land, the oppressive weight of the curse, dragging him deeper into the soil. The sunflowers reached for them, the tips of the stems growing longer and sharper, moving faster as if they had a life of their own. Avery screamed and tried to move, but her feet were stuck to the earth as though it was pulling her down, unwilling to let her go. It was too late. The farm had already claimed them. "No," Dylan cried, his voice breaking. "No, please, we can't." But before he could finish his sentence, a dark shape emerged from the center of the field. It was the pigman. His grotesque form loomed in the distance, moving with unnatural speed toward them, his twisted body contorting in ways that no human being should be able to move. His snout was full of sharp, jagged teeth, his eyes full of malice as they locked onto Avery and Dylan. Avery's heart hammered in her chest as the pigman approached, but she couldn't move. The curse had taken hold of her. It was too late to break free. And then the earth shook again. A powerful force rippled through the field, and before Avery could react, Dylan stepped forward, his face set in grim determination. "Avery," he said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "I have to do this. I have to do this for us." "No, Dylan, no." Avery screamed, but it was too late. He was already stepping into the center of the field, walking toward the sunflowers, walking toward the sacrifice. The farm had already taken so much. It wanted him. And now Dylan, brave, loving Dylan, was giving himself up. The ground beneath Avery's feet seemed to open up, pulling Dylan deeper into the earth as he moved toward the center of the ritual. The sunflowers closed in around him, their petals sharp and jagged, their thorns reaching out like claws to claim him. "No!" Avery screamed again, but her body refused to move. The land had swallowed her, and now it was swallowing him too. The ritual had to be completed, but at what cost? With a heartbroken cry, Avery watched as the land took Dylan, her love, her only lifeline. His body was pulled into the ground, swallowed by the cursed soil, his screams echoing in the night. The sunflowers trembled, their thorns retracting as if satisfied. And then there was nothing. The land fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of the sacrifice. But Avery knew deep down that the curse was far from over. It had claimed Dylan, but it wasn't finished with her yet. She had to finish the ritual. She had to destroy the farm's core. With her last ounce of strength, Avery turned toward the sunflower field, the dark heart of the curse. She raised her hands high, the widow's bones clenched tightly in her fist. She recited the final incantation, the words coming from her lips as if they were burned into her very soul. And with one last defiant scream, she brought the bones down onto the earth, breaking the curse once and for all. The ground shuddered beneath her feet, and the earth began to split open. The sunflowers wilted, their one-slush petals crumbling to dust as the curse was broken. The farm shook, the air thick with the energy of the land's final battle, but it was over. Avery had broken the curse, but at what cost? Dylan was gone, swallowed by the land. And as she stood there watching the farm crumble into ruin, she knew that the price of freedom was always higher than she could have ever imagined. The farm had taken everything from her. And now, there was nothing left but the ashes of what had once been. The price of escape. Avery had run until her legs burned and her breath came in ragged gasps. Her body ached, her mind was fractured, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The curse had consumed the farm, and with Dylan's sacrifice, the ritual was finally complete. The earth had split beneath her, the sunflowers, those monstrous, dark flowers, had crumbled into dust. The land had taken everything from her, but she had broken its hold. She had escaped, or so she thought. The dust hadn't even settled, and already she could feel it, the weight of the farm, of the curse, pulling her back. It was as if the ground itself was calling to her, reaching out with invisible hands, beckoning her to return. As she walked away from the ruin of the farm, the twisted, dead sunflowers still lingering in her mind, she thought she could hear it, the faintest whisper on the wind, her name. Avery shook her head violently, forcing her thoughts to clear. She had to leave. She couldn't let herself think about the farm, not after what had happened. The shadows, the screams, the twisted souls that had been absorbed by the land, it was over. She had broken the curse. She was free. But as she drove away from the farm, heading back to the city, the unease never left her. It was like a shadow that clung to her, a weight pressing on her chest. Every mile she put between herself and the farm seemed to be filled with a growing sense of wrongness, an undercurrent of something that refused to be shaken. The farm wasn't done with her. The streets of the city seemed so different now, too bright, too loud. People walked past her oblivious, lost in their own little worlds, while Avery's heart raced with every step. She could feel it, the land, still with her, still chasing her, following her. It was like a disease, a sickness that had rooted itself deep inside her. She had tried to go back to her normal life, to find a sense of comfort in the familiar chaos of the city, but everything felt wrong. Her apartment felt empty despite the clutter of her belongings. The once welcome hum of the city streets now grated on her nerves, the noise too loud, too jarring. The glow of streetlights outside her window felt like the pale light of the farm, unnatural, distant, and cold. It wasn't just the atmosphere. It was the visions. They came to her in flashes at the edges of her vision, when she least expected them. The sunflowers, their dark, twisted faces, their petals sharp and cruel. They were always watching her, lurking in the corners of her world. She could see them growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, stretching toward her like something alive, their black centers gazing at her, calling her back to the farm. Her apartment was filled with the scent of the farm, a sickly, earthy smell that reminded her of the decay beneath the soil. She woke up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, her body drenched in sweat. She thought she could still feel the land beneath her, pulling her down, dragging her into the dark places she had tried so hard to escape. Avery tried to ignore it, the creeping feeling that something was wrong, that the farm was still inside her. She began to question herself. Had she truly escaped? Or had the curse just been lying in wait, biding its time until it was ready to claim her once again? As days passed, the visions grew stronger, more frequent. She saw the farm in the reflection of her coffee cup, in the mist rising off the pavement in the morning, in the trees lining the streets. And then, one evening, as she walked home from work, she saw something that made her heart stop. The corner of the street was bathed in a sickly light, casting long, twisted shadows on the sidewalk. But as Avery turned the corner, her eyes landed on something that made her stomach lurch. A scarecrow, standing motionless in the middle of the street. It was a distant figure, but she knew what it was the instant she saw it. It wasn't just a decoration. It was a part of the curse. The scarecrow was not right. Its arms were unnaturally long, its body twisted and deformed. Its face was hidden beneath a burlap sack, but Avery could see the outline of something moving beneath it, a shape that shouldn't have been there. The scarecrow turned its head toward her, and though it didn't have eyes, she could feel its gaze, cold, unforgiving, and deep. Avery stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The street was empty, no one else in sight, yet she could feel the presence of the scarecrow. It wasn't a trick of her mind. She wasn't imagining it. The farm had followed her. Panic surged in her chest. She turned to run, but as she did, something else caught her eye: the sunflowers. They were growing in the cracks of the sidewalk, their faces dark, their stems twisted and thick, pushing up through the concrete as though the land was claiming the city as its own. Avery's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her legs shaking, but the ground felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. The earth was moving, and she was no longer in control. She ran blindly, her vision clouded with the images of the farm, of the pigs, the scarecrows, the twisted versions of her loved ones that had come to her in the darkness. The air around her was suffocating, pressing down on her chest. She thought she could hear the cries again, the child's voice pleading with her to come back. It was the farm. The farm had never let her go. Avery reached her apartment, slamming the door shut behind her, but she could feel the land seeping in. The walls were no longer her protection. They were a prison. As she collapsed onto the couch, gasping for air, she thought she saw something in the corner of her eye. She turned, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadow of the sunflowers, flickering in the light from the street lamp outside her window. But the shadow was moving. It wasn't just the farm that was following her. It was the curse. It had claimed her, and it would never let her go. She had been marked. The land had woven itself into her very soul, and there was no escaping it now. Avery closed her eyes, but even then she could still see the twisted faces of the scarecrows, the grotesque figures of the pigs, the dark, ever-watching sunflowers. And in the distance she could still hear the child's cry echoing in her mind. The farm had called her name, and now she was part of it, forever trapped in its twisted cycle. She had escaped, but at what cost? As the clock ticked away the minutes, Avery knew the truth. There was no escape, not from the farm, not from the curse. And so, with that realization sinking deep into her chest, Avery understood. She would never be free. The farm had claimed her, and it would call her back again and again until the end of time. In the haunting tale of the farm's curse, Avery, a woman seeking solace, is drawn into an eerie and darkly supernatural world when she accepts a job as a caretaker for a secluded farm. As she navigates the farm's unsettling rituals, she uncovers the terrifying truth. The farm itself is alive, a cursed land bound by ancient dark forces. From the strange sunflowers to the human-like pigs and the twisted scarecrows, Avery slowly becomes entwined in a sinister force that feeds on the souls of those who venture onto the land. Despite her desperate attempts to break the curse, Avery is forced to confront the horrific reality that the land has already claimed her, and the curse will never truly let her go. The story delves into themes of sacrifice, destiny, and the consequences of ignoring dark histories that lurk in the shadows. Avery's tragic journey is a reminder of the unrelenting grip that certain forces, be they emotional, spiritual, or supernatural, can have on our lives, and how the past, no matter how deeply buried, can rise to shape our future. The farm, in its twisted and horrifying manifestation, mirrors the idea that some things in life, whether guilt, regret, or trauma, cannot be escaped. They follow us, and eventually we must face them head-on. Avery's struggle and eventual entrapment on the cursed land speak to a deeper psychological and emotional truth. Sometimes, we are bound to our past in ways that we don't fully understand or recognize until it's too late. It's a stark reminder that running from our demons, whether they are external or internal, is not a viable solution. Eventually, we must confront them, or we risk being consumed. The story of Avery's entrapment by the farm's curse offers an important lesson about confronting our fears and unresolved pasts. Much like the cursed farm, the emotional baggage we carry, be it from trauma, guilt, regret, or unresolved issues, can begin to feel like an unshakable presence in our lives. These emotional curses can consume us if left unchecked, much like the land's curse slowly consumed Avery. The longer we avoid confronting these feelings, the stronger their grip becomes, distorting our perceptions and holding us back from moving forward in life. In our modern lives, we often seek distractions, whether through work, social media, or temporary escapes, to avoid dealing with the uncomfortable or painful aspects of ourselves. But as Avery's story shows, this avoidance only leads to greater consequences. Confronting our fears, our mistakes, and our traumas is the key to healing and finding peace. It may be difficult and frightening, but like the ritual Avery tried to perform, only through facing these challenges can we free ourselves from the burdens that hold us down. This story also teaches us about the power of choices. Avery's decisions, whether it was to break the rules, attempt the ritual, or choose to fight the curse, were all choices that carried immense weight. In our own lives, our choices, big and small, have the power to shape our reality and determine our future. The most difficult choices often hold the greatest potential for transformation. What do you think about Avery's journey and the lesson it imparts? Do you believe that the curse represents emotional or psychological burdens we can't outrun, or do you interpret it differently? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Let's start a conversation and reflect on the deeper meanings behind this tale. Your insights are valuable and will help others explore different perspectives. If you enjoyed this story and the lessons it brought to light, please subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more thrilling and thought-provoking content. Your support motivates us to continue creating engaging narratives that explore life's deepest questions and darkest mysteries. Thank you for being part of our journey. Together, we can uncover even more stories that make us reflect, question, and grow.